Yeah, so Father, whatever the battles it is right now that we're facing, God, maybe they're relational battles, maybe they're financial battles, maybe they're health battles. God, help us to turn those over to you, to trust you, to trust your strength, to trust your goodness, not to get the ends we desire, but to trust you that you would be at work. God, I pray that you would wash over us with that peace, the peace of your strength and the peace of your love. God, as we open the word today, I pray that you would speak to us, that you would mold us, that you would shape us. God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. People said, Amen. Well, good morning, church. If we haven't met yet, my name's Andrew. I'm on the team here at Liberty Towers. A few years ago, the Canadian government, which, Canadian, by the way, the Canadian government had this program where you could take your old, beat-up, heavily polluting cars, and you could exchange them in order to get a rebate towards a new electric car. And so we had an old diesel Jetta it was running on fumes, it was held together by duct tape. It was really worth nothing, but we traded it in, and we were able to get this sizable chunk so we could buy a nice, zippy, little new electric car. But my kids are really sentimental, and so they needed to come with me on our Jetta's last drive. So we had to drive it in. The place we had to drop it off was actually a wrecking yard. And I remember pulling into the driveway of the wrecking yard when from the back seat came this terrified scream, a cry, a burst. My daughter, Addison, she saw the stack of crushed cars, and she screamed, "That's not what they're going to do to our car, is it?" I went, "No, sweetie, our car is going to live on a nice farm upstate." But yeah, her reaction was just this visceral terror that they were going to crush her car. But if you ever want a good perspective on the consumerism dream in North America, go to an auto wrecking yard. All of those cars, once the epitome of design and technology, all shining and glistening on the front of a dealership with price tags, you know, this probably the second most expensive purchase in your life, the shouting, "I will make you happy," they were all there brand new and shining, only to end up crushed and stacked on top of each other, waiting to be recycled. In fact, each of our cars, whether you enjoy your car, you like your car or not, or the car perhaps that you're dreaming of having one day, will end up on that heap. All of them. They're going to end up crushed. See, there's a principle in nature. It's a law, actually, and it's called the law of atrophy. The law of atrophy says that everything over time decomposes, destructs, breaks down, and wears away. When you leave a piece of fruit out on the counter, the law of atrophy sets in, it decomposes, turns back into dirt. Your kids' rooms, even, when left on their own, right, they don't get cleaner magically over time. They degrade and turn into sort of pits of disaster over time. And our own bodies, the law of atrophy in our own bodies, they're breaking down over time. The cells break down. I was feeling that this morning. I went for my Sunday morning jog, and my knees were creaking and groaning and screaming, and I was feeling the effects of atrophy in my body. Solomon is at the end of his life. King Solomon, the wisest, the richest, the one who had the most of everything, is at the end of his life writing a reflection to us on where life is to be found. And this is what he has to say to us in the very last chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes. This is it. This is the end of it. It's been a bit of a slog. It's kind of heavy. But for me, it's been so life-giving to look honestly at the difficult things in life. So if you get your Bibles, we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, starting in verse 1, or the screen here behind me. "Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come, and the years draw near to which you will say, 'I have no pleasure in them.' Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain." He starts off by saying, remember, in his old age, on his deathbed, he says, get your heart right with God in your youth. Don't wait. Don't expect that, like, I'm going to live my life hedonistically pursuing every pleasure in my youth, and then on my deathbed, I'll repent, turn to Jesus, and he'll save me. He says, don't do it. He says, first of all, I think the first principle is you never know when your time will come, when your number will get pulled. You have no idea when that will come or what it will look like. He says, don't expect that you can just have an end of a very long life, turn to Jesus moment. Don't plan on that. But I think even more importantly, what Solomon is trying to tell us is someone who lived at the pursuit of every pleasure. At the end of his life in disappointment, he says also, listen, what I'm saying is don't pick up religion. Don't pick up a set of rules and laws. God wants to protect you and give you life. That following Jesus is not about denying yourself good things. It's about protecting and enjoying the life that God has actually made you to live. And Solomon is saying, listen, in your youth, whether I think for Solomon, each of us are in our youth, whether, you're Jackie or, Colin and Bailey's little one, right? In our youth, turn to the Lord before it's too late and experience the life that he has for us. Verse 3, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men are bent and the grinders cease because they're few, and those who look through the windows are dimmed. He's describing old age. He's describing the atrophy of his body. And he's saying, listen, before you experience all of this, get right with God. He's saying when the keepers of the house tremble, those are your hands and your arms. He says that which were once strong and did everything for you, now they start to tremble and they spill coffee when you're just holding them. Your arms and your hands grow weak. He says the strong men are bent. He's talking about his legs. There's an old man who walks our neighborhood every morning, and it's just amazing as he shuffles along to see the bend and the curve in his legs. It's hard to believe, but Solomon's saying is even the pillars of your legs, they will bend as you get older. The grinders cease. He's saying the teeth are falling out. His teeth are falling out of his mouth. And those who look through the windows are dimmed. He's saying that his eyesight is going. He's describing this process of atrophy in his own body, that he's getting old. I find I'm in an interesting season of life right now with my parents. I see my parents getting old. My dad recently had surgery on his shoulder, and during the recovery, he had to sleep in his lazy boy chair, and he really wasn't very active for about a month. And what happened was that his sciatica began to sort of seize up, act up, and at one point, talking to him on the phone, it was his hip was bothering, his back was bothering way more than his shoulder, and he was hunched over, his arm in a sling. He couldn't stand completely upright. He was at a 45-degree angle, and he had a walker that he had to hold on to with one hand. I was like, my dad is an old man. I remember when he would run around and was full of life and strength, and he's just this very different guy now in his old age. It's like, he's in this age of life where they used to sing the Garth Brooks songs, right? That I have friends in low places, and now he sings more the parody of that song, which is all my friends have hip replacements. And it's a different season of life as his body breaks down and atrophy sets in. Verse 4. And the doors on the street are shut. He's talking there about his mouth. And when the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird. He's talking there about how in his old age, apparently he's having to get up in the middle of the night frequently. And how even the smallest sound will wake him up early in the morning, and then he's up for the rest of the day. And all the daughters of song are brought low. He's talking about his hearing is going. Verse 5, they are afraid also of what is high and the terrors that are in the way. He says, I'm afraid of things I wasn't afraid of before. Even going upstairs is terrifying to me now. He's talking about his courage is waning as the atrophy sets in. The almond tree blossoms, his hair is going gray. Oh, poor him, his hair is going gray. The grasshopper drags itself along. It's this picture of a grasshopper once that was hopping along and now has to drag itself because everything is failing. And desire fails. He's talking there about his libido. And Solomon had a world-famous libido. And he says even that begins to fade and fail because man is going to his eternal home and the mourners go about the streets. Solomon sees death around the corner. Atrophy has taken its hold. He's reflecting here at the very end of his life. Remember, a life filled with over 700 concubines and wives with palaces. He had so much silver and gold, he didn't know what to do with it. And so he would take silver and just beat it into these circles and hang them on his wall. He had money as artwork in his palace. He was the most revered, most respected person in the land. He says, before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern. He's talking there about the moment of death. Picture a chain holding a silver bowl with a lamp in it, and it only takes one of those chains to break in order for the lamp to spill over and the light to go out. He says, I'm on the verge. It just needs one last thing, and my life is broken and done. Or he's going to get water, that life-giving water from a well, but the pitcher is broken and he can't get water, or the wheel is broken. It's that coming to the end of life, the end of his breath. And then verse 8, vanity of vanity, says the preacher, all is vanity. And this is what we call an inclusio. His last word, Solomon's last word in this book, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. It's actually the exact same words he used in chapter 1, verse 2. He opens the book with vanity of vanity, all is vanities. He closes the book with the same thing. That word vanity in Hebrew is chevel, and it means breath. It's in Canada, when it's cold out, you can breathe out and you actually see your breath. There's that mist. It's a vapor. But it's only there for a second, and then it's gone. Chevel is that breath, that mist. And it's not meaningless, but it's just fleeting. It's very temporary. It's only there for a moment, and then it's gone. And he's saying everything is that breath. Everything is fleeting. Everything is fleeting. And then there's the compiler editor of the book, picks it up here in verse 9. He says, besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying many proverbs with great care. So we have this compiler or editor who's taken the writings of Solomon and can put them together, and maybe some other people, and he's open and he's closing the book. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. We have in the Bible are words written by people. People just like you and me, real people with flaws, with issues, but were inspired by God. The Spirit of God gave them words to write down and maintain, and God speaks to us through their words, through even their broken lives. Like a guy like Solomon, God uses him, inspires him, uses his words to speak truth to us. The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. A goad was a stick, sometimes with a nail at the end, and it was used to poke and move animals along. It was meant to inflict pain in order to elicit movement. And what he's saying is that the words in this book have not been easy. Ecclesiastes is not a fun-loving, gee, we're really encouraged kind of a book, but it's like a goad that's meant to inflict pain to get us to move, to do something, to push us along the way. My son, beware of anything beyond these, of making many books. There is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. It's a wisdom book. But what he's saying here is, listen, you can fill your heads with lots of information. There are books about books about books about books. You can spend your life filling your head with knowledge, but there are lots of people who are extremely smart who are idiots when it comes to life. Wisdom is not about knowing lots of stuff. Wisdom is about knowing how to live well. And what he's saying is, don't get caught up in spending your life trying to just get more knowledge. Instead, use wisdom and live well. In the end of the matter, all that has been heard. So he sums up the book with this one sentence: fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. The end of Ecclesiastes, the summary of it all, of the life of Solomon, is fear God and keep his commandments. We are all in the process of getting older. And Solomon is writing at the edge of his life. And he realizes, as we've seen, he's realized through this book that he can't control anything. Though he's the most powerful king in the lands, he realizes he can't ultimately control anything. Not only that, he can't keep anything. All of the wealth, all of the stuff, all the treasure, he can't keep any of it. He realizes that his prestige and his honor and his accomplishments are all beginning to fade, and all of his inheritance, his kingdom, he's going to pass it on to his kids, and he knows, and sure enough he's right, that his kids are going to squander it and lose it all. Nothing is forever. He realizes that no matter what he's tried, whether it was wisdom or folly or stuff or women or power, whatever it is, it will not satisfy. He is constantly disappointed. Things he realizes don't always work the way they should, that decay and atrophy are inevitable. There's no promise for anything outside of the moment, and that karma is not a thing that we can control God with. It's just not a formula. And so it's the perspective that life is fleeting and temporary. And he repeatedly says over and over again that therefore, right, eat, drink, and be merry. He says, listen, enjoy a good meal, have a drink. He says, enjoy the moment, enjoy the people around you, enjoy the blessing of the moment that God has given you. Live in the moment. But then he also says, don't live for the moment. Meaning that living in the moment, though, won't give you any kind of permanence or meaning to your life. None of that will last. That is good and it's a blessing, and that's what we can do in the moment because that's all we have. But when we look to what is the security of what our lives are about and the meaning and the purpose, he says even that, there's something deeper. And the deeper that will last is to fear God and obey his commandments. Fear, we've talked about this a few months ago. Fear is not terror. I think it's acknowledging that there could be terror, but it's coming to God honestly as we stand before the creator of the universe, absolutely holy, absolutely other, absolutely perfect, eternal, and sovereign. And we, being sinners, stand before that God. And there's this, first of all, there needs to be this fear and reverence and awe. And it really is a matter of keeping that proper perspective in place so we don't presume upon the kindness of God. That we remember in fearing God who the universe revolves around, and it isn't me. That I am not the keeper of truth. That I need to revolve around God. See, Isaiah in the Old Testament, who was the holiest dude in his day, he has this vision where he encounters God in the temple. And he doesn't just like walk up and slap a high five and go like, I've been waiting for you. What took so long? No, he falls on his face. And he goes, woe is me, for I'm a person of unclean lips. And I come from a people of unclean lips, meaning I'm a sinner. And he falls in fear, but then God picks him up, sets him on his feet in grace. And that's what we talked about last week, the gospel. The gospel is that we don't live in terror, that we start with fear, but that fear then brings us to a place where God sets us on our feet, gives us grace and mercy and love, and gives us a reason and invites us to stand with him. But in the Old Testament, the idea of fearing God and obedience is a little different than now. So in the Old Testament, there were 10 big commandments, right? The big 10. Don't murder, don't steal, honor your parents, don't commit adultery. Again, kids in the room, honor your parents. That's in the 10 commandments. I'm just saying. The big 10. But there's also 613 other laws. Some of those laws were civil. So they were a new nation. They didn't have a police force. They didn't have courts. They didn't have jails. And so some of the laws were about how do we operate as a people that are just trying to discover who we are and keep society from corrupting and atrophying into sort of mass chaos. So some of the laws were civil. Some of the laws were ceremonial. So how do we worship? And a lot of the ceremonial laws were all about teaching the people who God was. And so a lot of the ceremonial laws had to do with purity and God's desire for purity. Like one of the random laws in the Old Testament is that people weren't allowed to wear any kind of mixed clothing. So no like poly cotton blends, right? It was only one kind. And that was to show, again, for every day when they got dressed, it was a reminder that God is pure and desires that I be pure. So there are those kind of ceremonial laws. And there are also then the moral laws, where God says, this is what you're to be about, and this is what you're not to be about. These are the boundaries for your lives. But we see all through the Old Testament, is really a story of failure, of people failing to live up to these laws. Constantly, time and time again, failing. They could not obey. And what would happen is this cycle that we all actually understand. So it starts off, things are good, things are fresh, things are new, and they're obeying, and there's this vibrancy to their life. But what happens is over time, they become complacent. Things are easy, things are comfortable, and they begin to slip, right? Maybe you start going to the gym and you're going faithfully and it's great, but then all of a sudden you feel strong and you're not hurting, and so you stop going to the gym and you start eating more ice cream, right? And you become complacent in the little habits in your life and you begin to slip, and it's like a circle that starts to go down until all of a sudden now you're doing everything opposite that you should be, and the people were getting complacent in their faith. And then God would send an obstacle or an opponent. And then they would feel pressure and they would feel pain and they would sort of bottom out and they would cry out to God, God, deliver me, help us, save us. And then God would send a deliverer. And then the cycle, they would come up and things would be good again. They would restore those healthy habits. They'd stop sinning and then they would get complacent again. And it was a cycle over and over and over again through the Old Testament. And it just showed that people could not live out the law on their own. There's atrophy in our spiritual lives that we tend to slide away. But we have in Jesus, the coming of Jesus, the advent of Jesus, where God himself puts on flesh. Jesus fulfills, we're told, fulfills the law, lives it perfectly, obediently. He fulfills it in our place, meaning that we're not expected to follow those 613 laws anymore if we accept the faithfulness of Jesus, that he did it in our place. And so no longer for me, living in fear, right relationship with God, and obedience doesn't mean I have to obey a list of rules. It means now it's about relationship with a person, with Jesus himself. And the law is summed up in the New Testament. We talked about this last week. The law is summed up going from 623 laws to 2. What are the first law is? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. So we've gone from 623 to 2. Because it goes from obeying a list to obeying a person. In the Bible, the word Christian only shows up like one place. And originally that word was an insult. It meant little Christs. And it was a derogatory slang word people would use. The way that the Bible talks about those who love Jesus, the word is called disciple. A disciple is someone who has a master or a rabbi and seeks to mold their life, model their life after their rabbi. It's about following in their footsteps, becoming like them. That's ultimately what this is about. So what does it mean to love God? See, last week we talked about the foundation for our lives, a life lived well. Foundation is the gospel, which is that God has done this work for us, that we receive it by grace, that God has done it for us. And then the drive of our life is a love for God. But what does that love look like? Our culturally, love has gotten so distorted that we tend to think it's this emotional sentimentality, right? That it's these feels. It's all the feelies. And we just need to, if we love God, we always have to have these feelies for God. And so we have to constantly have worship music around us. And if we're not feeling it, then we're not loving God. And I need to almost like boyfriend Jesus or prom date Jesus. I just have to have this emotional wellspring of love for God. And we feel guilty if we don't. But is that love? Is it the emotional feelies? How does God love us? Does God look down on us, just constantly overwhelmed by his feelings for us? Like, oh, those knuckleheads never get it together, but I just love them so much. I just love so deeply and long for them. So, no! That's not who God is. You want to see what love looks like? We look to the cross. The bloodiest, goriest event in history where Jesus goes to the cross, says, this is how much I love you, and this is what love looks like. It's sacrificial. It's action. It provides for a need. And so our love for God is not that I feel like he's my boyfriend. That's not what it's about. That's really uncomfortable as a dude, let's be honest. No. It's about sacrifice, about choice, about volition, about meeting needs. And so what does it look like to love God? Here's what it says in 1 John. 1 John 5:3. For this is the love of God. This is how we love God. We keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. But in the New Testament, we understand the commandments is about knowing and following Jesus as a disciple. It's about relationship and connection to Jesus. That's what it's about. It's not about the list of Old Testament laws. It's about, am I following Jesus? And so we can call ourselves Christians, but let's be honest. Does my life look like Jesus? I can show up here on a Sunday, but am I following Jesus? Does my life this year look more like Jesus than it did last year? That is the big question. Who's in charge? So how do we do this? Practically. How do we do this? I've had a couple conversations this week and it keeps coming up. So I was like, maybe that's why. Maybe we need to talk about this. Is what does it mean to be a disciple? Because I think sometimes we overcomplicate it. Here are my 4 pillars. So if you're a note taker, you can take notes because this is something I want to come back to regularly. We've said it before in the past, but this is what my prayer, my heart for you individually, but also what I want to see us as a church emphasize and be about. Okay, are you ready? What does it mean to fight the atrophy in our lives and pursue Jesus, following and obeying? Number 1, what does it mean? Number 1, it is submission to the word. Not just reading the word, not just reading it like a checklist, like I put in my 3 verses this morning, so God is happy with me, or memorizing it, or it's actually going, what does this say, and will it form who I am and change who I am? And when I disagree with this, this wins. It's submission to the word. Are you in it, and is it forming and changing you? That's the first, I think, most important principle of the Bible is it changing you? Are we listening to it? The second pillar, I believe, of discipleship is relational prayer. That's not just my checklist, my wish list of like, okay, God, here are all the things I want, and you're like a vending machine. If I put in the right prayer the right number of times, you'll give me what I want, and then ultimately I become the center of the universe again. No, prayer is about relationship, and actually our faith is about relationship, about that connection to Jesus, about knowing him, about hearing from him, listening to his voice. Not just like, we don't just have God's time booked for an hour on a Sunday morning, right? We've booked him from 11 to 12, he's here, and then you can come back next week and meet him again. No, when we leave this place, it's an ongoing, unceasing prayer. When you go to work, when you're wrestling with stuff, when your kids are driving you nuts, God is trying to do something in that relationship. You go, God, what are you trying to do in me through my kids? Knowing that he's trying to do something all the time through us and in us. Relational prayer. And I think the first piece of that, what does it mean to love God? I think these are the 2 things that he expects and wants from us, is to be submitting to his word, what he said to us, and be in relationship with him in prayer. Number 3, and this is where I think we get into the, what does it mean to love others? Number 3 is hearts of service. Meaning that God has, I think, put an expectation design into us that we're called to serve, that we are called to meet the needs of other people, that God has given each of us gifts, he's given us talents, and he's given us resources. And each of those are different. It's not a cookie cutter, but it's saying, God, who can I serve? And I think there's 2 areas I want to push us as a church that we consider. A, when we walk through these doors on a Sunday morning, instead of going, I am coming to receive, I am coming to get, feed me, it's about me having those feelies, emotional, like, no. What if as a church, we walk through those doors on a Sunday morning and we said, God, show me somebody I can serve. And maybe that's just having a conversation. Hey, how was your week? Maybe it's saying, hey, how can I pray for you this week? And then do something radical, pray for them. Maybe you'll see a need or hear a need that you can meet. Maybe you can just take someone out. How can I serve when I walk through these doors? Maybe it's in different roles around. How can I serve? I think there's something within us that comes alive when we serve others. But then it's also when we leave this place, how can you serve? Maybe it's your kid's sports team. Maybe you can serve there. Maybe there's something in your neighborhood you can serve. Maybe there's somebody down the street who's infirmed and lonely, and you can just go and make them cookies once in a while and spend time with them. How can you serve others? It doesn't mean you have to fix every problem yourself, but what's one need that you have the resources and the opportunity to meet? That's kingdom work. And there's something in us that comes alive when we serve. I believe we're made to serve. And then finally, number 4, it's lives in community. We're not made to do this life alone. We can't. We need people around us who will help us, people who will encourage us, and also people who will admonish, meaning sometimes hold us accountable. And we need that back and forth. I need you, and you need me. That kind of interdependence is what community is about. And imagine gathering together inside this place, outside this place, with a group of people where you're doing life together. There's people who care about your kids. And they're going to their sports games. And you care about their kids. And when their kids have a game, you're going to that too. Imagine having that kind of life where you're not just independently trying to navigate it, but doing it as a community. How do we break the atrophy in our lives and pursue Jesus as disciples? I don't think we have to have 1,000 programs here at the church. I don't think it's about being in every Bible study every night of the week. I don't think that's what it's about. I don't think it's about having 80 different churches that we're going to and worshiping all the time. I think it's simply these 4 things in our lives, implementing them in our lives, reading the word, submitting to it, being in relational prayer, finding a place to serve, and having a community around you. I think it's that simple. And as you do that, more and more you're going to grow. You're going to break the chains of atrophy. And what does it mean to live a meaningful life that will last beyond yourselves? I think those are the 4 key pillars that Solomon is calling us to begin doing in the days of our youth, before it's too late, before your teeth fall out. And in so doing, find true life. The life that Solomon himself missed the pursuit of everything else. Submission to the word, relational prayer, hearts of service, and lives in community. God wants you to live. And that's where we find it. Let me pray. So God, thank you for your grace and your mercy towards us, that we don't deserve it, but you pour it out on us anyway. Thank you for the example in the life of Solomon, who every temptation we ever come across, he dove at it, only to show us that it's hollow and futile, and there's something more. God, help us to pursue these things with our lives, breaking the chains of atrophy, spiritual atrophy, that we might walk towards you, find you, know you, and experience the life that you have for us. Jesus, we lift all these things up in your mighty name. Amen. Let's sing.